Hello, can you hear me now?
Hi, Frank.
We
Sorry
got
about
there.
that. Can you hear us?
I can hear you guys. How's everyone doing today? Thanks so much for having me. I am going to record this so that if there are any members of your team that missed this session, they'll have something to point back to.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So from what I understand, I have about 40 minutes with you guys. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to run through my presentation as quickly as possible and leave as much time as I can for questions and answers, because whenever I do this, the Q&A session is always the most valuable, most important part. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to see if I can share my screen. All right, did that work?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. I can't see anyone, but I can see my presentation. So thank you guys so much for having me today. My name is Frank Pavikevich. I'm the director of All-American Model UN. I've been in the Model UN community for over 16 years, and I've been the director of All-American Model UN for the past 7. And it's really been a life-changing experience for me. Our general mission is to help the overall Model UN community in the United States and around the world to grow and to elevate their performance. The heart of All-American Model UN really is our international travel team. This is how All-American Model UN started 7 years ago. This year in 2019-2020, we'll end up going to about 7 different international conferences around the world. The goals of the travel team are much like your travel team. They're really to expand your horizons, get you to think differently with the added benefit and value of that international travel. But I point all of this out because all of the tactics that I'm about to teach you are tried and proven. We've won now 26 consecutive delegation awards. So in the 7 years I've been doing this, we've yet to not win a team award at one of these conferences. And there's the list for you. The moral of the story, though, is awards aren't fair. They're completely subjective. And that's what Model UN, that's how Model UN is. It makes it so frustrating and addicting and rewarding. I always tell people that even though awards may or may not be your main motivating factor, the results still matter. And I'm going to teach you guys exactly how I teach my teams on how to prepare, perform, and replicate during Model UN conferences. So over my years doing Model UN and teaching Model UN, I've identified 4 key success variables: preparation and research, pattern recognition, advocacy, and emotional intelligence. Because this is a pretty abbreviated session, we're going to focus on 2 of them today, mainly preparation and pattern recognition. And this is a great starting point for where I think all of you guys will want to be going with your Model UN careers. So starting off with preparation, what do I have my students do to prepare for a Model UN conference? This is the first step. Before every conference, I have all of my students do something called a pre-conference assignment. Now, a lot of conferences require you to write position papers or submit some sort of other research. Maybe your teachers even make you make binders before conferences. It's a lot of work. This is a way to condense all of that research into a single sheet. So, international issues in Model UN are incredibly complicated and complex. Because of that, you have to really address each issue, each topic, from multiple angles. And the way that I tell all of my students to do it is to address it from political, social, and economic. So before you start developing novel solutions of your own, you have to analyze what's been done in the past. And that's what this table is allowing you to do. You want to look at everything that's been done in the past to treat your issue from a political stance, from a social stance, and then from an economic stance. These 3 pillars are what make up international solutions. When you go and you start researching, you're going to see how many different avenues you can possibly go down, and this is a way to help you guys organize your research in a succinct and clear way. And the reason you want to analyze past solutions is you want to see whether or not they worked and to what degree they worked. So the second row of this table is an area for you to do that analysis. Did the solution that was implemented work, and to what degree, and then figuring out why or why not it didn't work. This is the first step. After you've analyzed the past solutions, you're going to see a very similar table now on this slide. You want to start to develop your new solutions. Again, looking at them from political, social, and economic lenses. A lot of Model UN conferences overseas actually allow you to write full draft resolutions before you go to conferences, as opposed to many of the conferences in the United States where you're not allowed to. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go into committee without a solution that you're ready to defend and advocate for. This is a way of plotting out what your strategy is going to be with your draft resolution by
Sorry, that's the overhead announcement.
Got it. This is a way of plotting out what your strategy is going to be for your draft resolution. Now, for those of you that have done Model UN, that have been to big conferences before, you'll note that a lot of the draft resolutions that gain prominence in committee all tend to have some sort of central theme. And this is the thread that's going to connect your political, social, and economic solutions together. A lot of times the theme of the paper ends up being the title of the paper, whether that's some sort of self-made acronym or it becomes some sort of framework that you're advocating for. Whatever that is, that's what I like to refer to as the heart of a draft resolution. When you're creating these solutions, you want your political, social, and economic to really tie into one another, so that when you're advocating for your paper, when you're lobbying on the floor of a committee room, you can express what the main idea is in 1 or 2 sentences. Now, obviously, your draft resolution is going to be a lot longer than that. So you're going to want to break that draft resolution up into different sections. Don't be afraid of using headers when you're writing your draft resolution so that you can categorize all of your education clauses together, all of your political clauses together, all of your economic incentive clauses together. This is a way of structuring a draft resolution so that it can be cohesive and comprehensive, and it also allows other people in your block to take charge of one of the aspects of your draft resolution. This is the only way that it's feasible to create these very long, multi-layered draft resolutions without going crazy. So you'll see at the bottom of this slide a whole bunch of sample clauses that you can potentially use when you're writing your draft resolution, all the different areas that you potentially could be touching on. In a crisis committee, it's slightly different. So the first couple of slides that I went through, these are for your very traditional General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, and some specialized agencies, where the goal of that committee is to pass a draft resolution which really just establishes a baseline consensus of what the international community can agree upon. Crisis committees are obviously very different from that. They're much more fast-paced, and the objective there is to develop rapid solutions in real time. So when you're researching and preparing for crisis committees, you have to adjust. In addition to doing one of those pre-con sets from the previous 2 slides, these are 2 other activities that I have all of my students complete before they get to a crisis committee. Number 1 is you have to understand the timeline of events. Whether it's a historic crisis committee or a contemporary crisis committee, you're going to want to know exactly how events laid out to get you to the current point. If it's a historic, you want to continue plotting out into the future. That's tip number 1. Number 2 is that you have to study the geography. This is especially important for historic committees because geography changes, political geography changes with time. So understanding that cities may have different names, that political boundaries may be different, even cultural boundaries can be drastically different depending on the time period. So I always test all of my students on geography. For example, in a few weeks we'll be going to Portugal to compete at a conference that's hosted by Yale. It's a European Union integrated conference, sort of like Simon is, how everything operates in one universe. So before all of my students get to go to that first committee session, they have to name all of the countries within the European Union, understand which countries are in the Schengen area, which are in the Eurozone, which are in NATO, which aren't in NATO. So understanding all of that geography will always give you a structural advantage when you're headed into a crisis committee. The next two steps are about defining your objectives. First is recognizing what the goals of the crisis committee are. A common pitfall that delegates make when they're going into a crisis committee is they're solely focused on their character's objectives and aims. But you have to understand that the chair or director who designed your committee is really looking to explore a particular avenue. So most crisis committees will have an objective, either a learning objective or an endpoint that the crisis director and chair want to get to. So trying to figure what that is, if it's not plainly stated, is a critically important part of your research. And then, of course, the added level of fun and intensity in a crisis committee is that your personal character is also going to have objectives for what they want to see done. So laying all of these things out gives you a path forward when you get into a crisis committee. But speaking of paths, what I have all of my students do is a mapping exercise. This is what a crisis director does when they're designing their committee, is they're trying to lay out what the arc of the overall committee is going to be. In my opinion, success in crisis committees is all about developing early momentum, being able to really establish yourself early as a key player in the committee. And you do that by developing your solutions as rapidly as possible. So before any of my students go into a crisis committee, I have them map out these 12 different scenarios. I say at the start of committee, what are 4 different ways that the crisis director, crisis room, or chair could make a first update to influence what the arc of the crisis committee is going to be? And then building off that into a second layer, what are 2 outcomes that could happen from that first update? And your objective in this exercise is to jot out how you would respond, how you think the committee should respond to each of these updates. Now, all of this is front of the room preparation. This is all trying to figure out how you're going to influence the front of the room, not so much at the back of the room. We don't have a ton of time today, so I'm not going to be spending a lot or really any time on back of the room collaborations and personal arc planning. But if you can become a presence in the front of the room, you're going to be looking to use backroom actions, your crisis note, your portfolio power actions to help guide what's happening in the front of the room. Don't disconnect the two. That's a common mistake as well. So that's a general overview of how I have my students prepare for conferences. The next thing I'm going to touch upon quickly is pattern recognition. Anybody who's gone to 2 or more Model UN conferences, whether they're small single-day conferences or 3,000 person 4-day conferences, are going to recognize that Model UN committees advance in a certain pattern. The key here is to 1, make personal goals for yourself for each of the steps of a committee, and 2, not give up hope. So many students, particularly early on in their Model UN careers, will get frustrated at some point because either the chair's not calling on them, they think somebody has stolen one of their ideas, they can't get into a block or they can't form a big enough block. But Model UN is a collection of different activities over the entire length of the conference. If you have an awful performance in the first half of the conference and have an awesome performance in the second half, you are still in a position to win an award. And the key to that is recognizing each of the different phases that you go through throughout the weekend. So beginning with traditional committees, I always tell people that committee begins half an hour before the first session. Getting to the room early, staking out where you're going to sit, walking around, and introducing yourself to as many people as you can. So my personal goal, I tell students, try to meet 15 people before committee even begins, and step out of your Model UN character. Introduce yourself personally, what your name is, what school you go to, ask them how long they've been doing Model UN, where they've traveled from. Don't get into the politics just yet. This is the relationship building aspect of Model UN. After that, in traditional committees, you'll usually spend time setting the agenda. Recognize that this is a step, and if you're involved with it, with speaking on the primary speakers list, with the lobbying for one topic over another, that's awesome. Those should be your goals. But if you don't get to participate in this part, it's only one of what I think are 11 different parts of a committee. Opening speeches on the secondary speakers list tend to get far more value and weight than they're actually worth. A lot of teams that I work with will spend months crafting their opening speech, and the fact of the matter is nobody will remember it by the second day. So don't overstress on that first speech in the secondary speakers list. Get your point across if you can make a speech, and encourage reaction from the rest of the room. That's what the goal is here. But again, if you don't get to speak on the secondary speakers list, we're only 3 parts in to a very multifaceted process. The first unmoderated caucus is probably the most critical time in the early stages of traditional Model UN committees. Now, the first unmoderated caucus can happen during the first session, or it can simply happen impromptu after that first session ends. Your goal here is, again, to establish yourself as a leader by developing connections with other people in the room, getting people's phone numbers and emails, starting a Google document to start drafting your draft resolution, or creating that WhatsApp group or GroupMe account that all of the people in the committee are going to be in. This is an important part. Don't run out of the room at the end of that first committee session. You want to show leadership by sticking around, talking to people, and developing connections. Now, here's something that's often overlooked, and there are a lot of strong feelings about it, but I have to recognize that this happens. At large conferences, a lot of work will happen before that second committee session on the second day. So showing up early with the people you've begun to develop your block with and writing out clauses is a really important step, because it shows that you're committed to pursuing a draft resolution. You're willing to put the time in, and you establish yourself as a block leader by doing this. So always, 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 if you can, show up early to those morning meetings. And then you fall into this cycle. You go into this moderated, unmoderated, moderated, unmoderated debate cycle. So recognizing that now that you're in this is really the heart of a committee, and you can see we're right about in the middle. If up until this point you have done nothing and you haven't accomplished any of your micro goals for the first 5 steps, you can jump in right here at number 6 and still be in a great position to win an award and demonstrate leadership and pass a draft resolution. But getting involved here is important to show your directors and your chairs that you're actively involved in the committee. Submitting the actual working papers to your dais, to your director, is an important part as well. So you don't want to ignore the fact that you have to interact with the chairs and the assistant directors and the assistant chairs. You want to be engaged with asking them questions about when will you accept draft resolutions? When can we submit? How many signatories? Have those small conversations with your director, because that, again, is what develops relationships with them. After this point, you're looking at authors panels and draft resolution presentations. If possible, you want to be on that authors panel. You want to be the one advocating for the clauses that you've written. Don't let people push you around. Don't feel slighted. But at the same time, if you don't make your way into an author's panel, also consider that it's only one step of the 11 that I'm outlining here. The merger process is generally what differentiates what order of awards you're going to come in. The difference between a verbal and a gavel is normally how effective you are at leading a merger process. Whether you're choosing to merge into one paper or if you're going to lead a multi-block merger, these are the things that you have to get yourself noticed for by making speeches, by getting other people to mention your name in committee, and by doing it in view sight of the director. The amendment process is something that's often overlooked by a lot of Model UN students. Don't give up on amendments. I've had students that have really messed up the first 9 steps of this process, inject themselves through amendments right at the end of committee, and still come out with an award. So, I mean, this is what I'm stressing over and over and over again, is it's never too late to re-engage and put yourself back into the conversation in the committee. And then finally, voting procedure. Lobbying people to either abstain or vote in favor of your draft resolution, trading votes, and making amendments and changes on the friendly side so that you can garner enough support to pass your draft resolution. So these are really the 11 steps that every traditional Model UN committee is going to go to. And setting predefined goals for each of these 11 steps is going to increase and better your performance exponentially, because you can do a hard reset after any of them. If you have a bad session, if you have a bad step 5, step 8, you can put yourself back in and go, okay, now we re-engage, now we restart at whatever the next step in the process is. In crisis committees, it's very similar, but that cycle of mod, unmod is really what takes over in the full view of a crisis committee. So again, recognize which part of the cycle you're in. You get the update from the crisis room, then there's a Q&A period normally. This is an important part of crisis committees because it shows that you're involved. A lot of the crisis staffers and crisis directors, they want to be asked questions. So ignoring the Q&A period is incredibly detrimental to your outcome in that committee. Then it's all about debating and writing what your directive is going to do. You want to be specific here. You want to be action-oriented. The worst thing you can do is just be the devil's advocate. I call it the voice of no. You don't want to be the person in the room saying, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. Be the person who pushes the narrative forward. Remember, the larger committee arc is something that the director of the committee is going to be paying a lot of attention to. So you have to be cognizant of what the goal of the overall committee is going to be, and you don't want to be a roadblock to that. You pass the directive, whatever directive or set of directives you're going to get is, and then you get another update. So all of this is one cycle. Each of these cycles can last anywhere between 15 minutes and an hour, but keep in mind as you're sitting in the room which part of the cycle that you're in so that you can jump back in. You can have a bad cycle, you can have a bad start to a cycle, and then re-engage by identifying which part of committee is going on and picking up from there. So this is a general club piece of advice, is start defining your process as a team. Figure out what your objectives for each conference, each committee are going to be. Set goals and measure yourself against those goals. Set team goals and measure yourself against those, and then make adjustments. All-American Model UN is here to be a resource for everyone. We have a bunch of different programs, activities, and resources available on the website, so make sure to go check that out if you're looking for something more extended past today. And that's all I have for you. My email address is there. It's frank@allamericanmun.com. I legitimately respond to every email that I get, so even after this presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I think we have some time left, so now I'd love to get some specific questions because I think that's going to really provide more value for you guys. You'll have access to this presentation afterwards. Let me see if I can get back around. All right. Hopefully I didn't put anyone to sleep. I've been talking for way too long. So anyone that has questions, now is your opportunity.
Okay, we've got a question here, John. Go ahead.
Hello. So I was wondering if you have main idea, something you would say for someone who's in historical committee. What's your main thing, main suggestion, main idea for them?
No geography.
No geography.
Period. Because if you're in committee and you can start referencing rivers and valley names and city names that other people have no idea what the hell you're talking about, you're in a huge advantageous position. One of the committees I did in college was the Treaty of Versailles. I was Woodrow Wilson, and starting to talk about Galicia and Silesia just blew past people's understandings of European geography, and they had no choice but to listen to what I was saying.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
How do you feel about going about cross committee, like let's say you're in the GA and talking to the Security Council or talking to your cabinet?
So your goal, this is a team strategy. At a conference like Simon, start pulling each other into your committees. Don't try to go to other committees. What each of you should be trying to do is help each other get pulled into other committees. Like specifically ask for your team's representative in the General Assembly to come to the Security Council or vice versa. That way it doesn't look like you're trying to take over a committee by saying, I should go, I should go, I should go. You want someone else to be like, nope, we want to talk to Germany specifically. So use that strategy as a team.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Russ.
I had a question. What do you think is the best way in order to control a cabinet and become like the best delegate in like a cabinet situation?
You have to be quick. Crisis committees are all about speed. So one of the ways that I train my students is we do speed directives. So I'll make an update. I'll say this is the committee, this is the update, and people have to write as many clauses as possible in 90 seconds. And then we go to the next one. This is the new update. Write as many clauses as you can in 90 seconds. Always be writing and then advocating for a way forward, not just saying this is stupid, we can't do this.
Other questions? Yep, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I don't know if I'm on screen or not, but I just had a question about like Security Council. What's like the best way forward? Since Security Council is a very unique, can actually take action. What's the best way to be like the best delegate there in regards to directives and speed?
In the Security Council, passing directives is much more important than in a General Assembly. So if you're in a General Assembly and your draft resolution doesn't pass, so be it. In the Security Council, that's the name of the game. So you have to make sure that you don't get vetoed by any of the permanent members. Ideally, a Security Council draft resolution gets adopted by consensus. So keep pushing consensus because the Security Council deals with the most pressing issues. That's how it's designed. Because of that, they can take the most action of any of the organs of the United Nations. But because of the size, it's almost designed for consensus adoption. The vetoes are supposed to be backstops. So you have to stay on policy and stay in reality. Don't get like some of the other crisis committees can sort of do like crazy directives and kidnappings and blackmailing and shit like that. Don't do that in the Security Council.
Yep.
Okay, so I will be France, the General Assembly,
Mhm.
and how to best like the fact that there's veto powers in the Security Council.
Ignore it. The General Assembly is situated one state, one vote. Your name recognition alone will get you called on more often by the chair and from other people in the room. So don't feel like you already have the advantage because you're France. Don't feel like you need to push that into like threatening Security Council veto stuff, because it just makes you sound like a jerk.
Yeah, I have a question.
Speak up so we can hear.
Sorry. I'm going to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the USSR cabinet in 1991. And I was wondering, like, what's it like going and talking to other committees, like if you're other committees and cabinets from the cabinet? Like, I understand that I'm going to have to be dealing with a lot of other cabinet, and I was wondering how the best way to deal with that.
Two things. One, really step into your role, like really enjoy yourself in what you're doing. And two, when you get summoned into other committees, make it a team activity and be like, yo guys, I'm going here. What do you want me to say? What's the message? Like be the representative of your committee, because that's going to show leadership, and it's going to show to your chair that you really care about the overall direction of your committee, not just about making yourself more noticeable.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just have a question. Do you have any tips for like how to stand out and get noticed by the peers?
Do well. Don't. You know, there are no tricks or things like that. Establish a human connection with your chair. Go in during that like pre-session time. Introduce yourself to your chair. You know, introduce what position you're going to be. Ask one or two questions about the committee. Find something in the background guide that's unclear and ask them questions. And don't be afraid of making eye contact with the chair during debate.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
I know you said that opening speeches aren't as quite important as other aspects, but in reference to that, would like including more like evidence and like information and being more straight to the point be more important than being like charming and like like worded?
Yeah. So two things there. Number one, how many people have heard a speech that has started, thank you, Honorable Chair, fellow delegates, right? I want you guys to strip that language out of your vocabulary. Stop wasting 5 seconds at the beginning of every speech with platitudes and make the point. Like you legit have 30 to 60 seconds to solve human trafficking. What are you doing patting each other on the back for, right? Get to the point you're trying to make. That's number one. Number two is that you have to distinguish your speaking style. And everyone is this is like a fingerprint. Everyone has a unique style, but Model UN students have this boring ass cadence in the way that they speak where it's just like da 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 da. It's almost like a bedtime lullaby, and it really does bore the crap out of chairs. So you have to do something to get remembered so that the chair wants to call on you again. So it's style and substance. So yeah, using statistics, using quotes, that's all fantastic. But if you sound like you're reading from the dictionary, you're not going to get called again.
Okay, so in past conferences, I've always had to play the so-called bad guy. First conference I played, I was North Korea. Now I'm Russia, Supreme Soviet of Russia. So how can you suggest playing a character that's way against your normal self? How do you play it better? I struggle with.
I mean, that's the point of simulation, right? Is to put yourself in those shoes. I would start off by not describing your country as bad, right? It's not like the ambassador from Russia to the United Nations is going in there like a cartoon villain with a twirly mustache, and they're like, how should I screw with the UN today, right? They're there to actually advocate for what they believe is the right policy forward for their sovereign country and the international community. So don't think of the spectrum as good and bad, as right and wrong. Just think of it as your lens, your vantage point into how to solve the issue.
Thank you.
Other questions? Anyone that has not yet asked a question? Alyssa?
So
Wait,
with,
we get to
I'm in the cabinet of 1991, so the Cold War has just ended, and one of our big topics is socialism and communism.
Mm-hmm.
My person is pretty far like socialist, and so they want everything to like start coming together. So what's the best way to portray that as not coming off as like communist? We should all be together.
Don't get tied up in the vernacular, in the vocabulary, especially this period of time in the early 90s. Socialism and communism are used interchangeably before this social safety net is well developed in Scandinavian countries, in Europe, and then spreads further than that. So don't get tied up in titles or that sort of stuff. Stick to the issues and advocate for the solutions, not for whatever you want to call this, the Rainbow Connection. Fine, as long as you're in favor of what the end game is, that's the only thing that matters.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yep, go ahead.
How would you best recommend a head delegate to go help her fellow country delegation? Yeah.
The rest of the team, right? This is sort of like a self-sacrifice, especially on the college circuit. A lot of head dels don't end up winning high awards because they're helping everyone else out. So doing those post-committee meetings and one-on-one feedback sessions is really important to keep morale up. Everything that I do on my teams is about building momentum and making sure nobody drops out, because Model UN delegation awards are really a game of numbers. If you bring 20 people to a conference and 12 win awards, no matter what kind of awards, you're likely going to win a delegation award, right? Model UN isn't a game of gavel or nothing. It's simply be in the discussion, don't give up, keep going, keep pushing. Model UN, especially these 3 and 4 day conferences, they're slogs, they're marathons. You don't win the race just because you're the first one out of the gate. You win it by completing it. And that's where most people screw up, is somewhere around halfway through the conference. They just get tired and call it quits. If you just push throughout and you perform in each of those 11 stages, you're going to have a successful outcome, most likely.
Yeah, Alex.
So I'm the 1991 Ukraine Minister of Foreign Affairs. How do I go talking to these huge? How do I go talking to France or the Soviet Union, these huge countries where just a few years ago we established democracy, and for decades before we were the USSR was almost a puppet?
Sorry, which country are you?
France, 1991 Foreign Affairs.
Foreign affairs. I mean, again, this is part of the simulation. You have to put yourself in this person's shoes. This dude in 1991 isn't sitting there saying, well, screw it, we're less powerful than everyone else, so I'm just going to sit here, right? It's about advocacy for the advancement of your people. So really put yourself in the position of there are millions of people that you are representing on the global stage as the foreign minister of Ukraine. What's your objective? What's the country's objective? And how do you best advocate for it? So don't get overwhelmed or intimidated by other people's positions, because everyone's just doing the same thing. You just want to be the best advocate that you can be to achieve your aim.
Okay. Any last questions? Do you, Frank, I don't know, we want to take the time, if we're past our time, do you have time for any more questions, or do you have to go?
Yeah, no, I have about 10 more minutes before my next meeting.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
So do you have any tips on sort of regaining control of a block or development of this resolution paper for this House delegate trying to
So one, I understand these terms like power dells exist, but I always tell people to either one, ignore it, or two, if you identify the power dell, go right up to them and try to be their best friend, not their worst enemy. That's a general tip, number one. Number two, how do you regain control? One person at a time. When I competed in college, West Point was one of the best teams in the country, and their sole objective the first day of the conference was to have the most people go with them to lunch. They wanted to have the most friends in the room. So sort of step outside of your role as a Model UN delegate and reassume your role as a human being and make those human connections, because at the end of the day, the people that like you are going to want to work with you. So you have to be liked by some people in your committee. You have to be well researched to show that you can demonstrate leadership, and then you have to advocate for your solutions. I know it's sort of a simple way of looking at it, but sometimes the simplest way is the most accurate.
Any additional questions? Oh, now they're coming. Okay, Isabella, yeah.
I'm not sure if this has been necessarily like said or like skimmed past, but like let's say you're kind of like running out of things to say and you've like done pretty well. If you're running out of like information or like points, like how do you still maintain a good like impression on the chair and in your committee?
Yeah, so three things. One, you should never run out of things to say. That's why you do research before a conference. If you've researched your topic well enough, you should constantly have things to say and different issues to bring up. Number two, if you do face we'll call it a mental logjam, which does happen, the best way to stay involved and show leadership is to ask other people in the committee what their thoughts are. And specifically call people out in your speeches. Like, China wants to know what Cambodia thinks about this issue, and China also wants to know how Mongolia will face this issue. Call out specific people to respond to your questions, and you'll start controlling debate. And number three is to just really lean into it. Like, really get into your character. Stop worrying about like, oh, where am I? Am I in the top 5 in committee? Does the chair like me? Ignore all that. Push it out of your head and just assume the role of the position you've been given. And you won't have that external stress, that outside noise clouding what you actually want to be accomplishing.
Okay, last question. Anyone that has not yet asked the question and wants to ask one? Okay, yeah, Roshan.
So just a quick follow-up question. Since I'm France in the Security Council, I do have veto power. How would I go about using that without seeming like I'm just like vetoing everything or only pushing directives that I support?
Yeah, so France historically hasn't used the veto power very often. If my knowledge is correct, I believe they've used it second less frequently, right in front of China. France threatens to use the veto in the Security Council, but in reality, it has very, very few red lines that would be willing to tank a resolution over. And their backstop is because the United States is always willing to use the veto power. The United States has used its veto more than any other country. So if something is like that absurd, France knows that the United States will vote no on it. So I would say use the veto power as a way to intimidate, allude to the fact that you have the veto power without ever threatening to veto a piece of legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. We really, really, really appreciate it. We learned a lot. Can't thank you enough for it. Well, you guys got anything else to say?
Thank you, guys. I had fun. If you have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and good luck at Simon.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right,
Take care.
have a great day.
You too.